Welcome. So let's dive in. So could you both tell us a bit about your stories, how you came to do the work that you're doing, and why is it important to you? I think is another piece of that, maybe end with that. Rob, why don't we start with you?
So I had the privilege of meeting Deepa through a beloved friend and colleague in the work, Claudia Chan, who is the founder of She Summit and She Global Media. And Claudia has been doing work around gender parity, particularly in the context of the corporate space and the work of inclusion. And Claudia was doing work with Deloitte and was raving about this new leader. You have to meet this new leader. And I would love for you to come in and support me in this context of helping her visioning, sort of what is the future of at the time, Dee and I, within the context of her role. And so we had the opportunity to come together for a full day training. And I think, I don't know, Deepa, 5 minutes maybe into the conversation, I almost feel like Melinda, she walked into the room and I was like, okay, so who is that soul?
Nice. Yeah.
And our whole kind of premise of being there was really, she was interested in having people push her thinking, really serious about the vision and the opportunity to take what had been a really successful initiative to the next level. And so that was how we met. And again, I was really struck by the sincerity and the commitment to really wanting to not only sort of create new language, but the real opportunity to kind of walk the talk. And what would it really look like to walk the talk in the context of innovation? And so that was how we met.
Awesome. And I see for those who can't see in the background, Ra has her book on a table, The Calling. Do you want to just say a few words about The Calling too?
So the book is really designed for people who are looking for their purpose. I believe all of us have one. And I know that sometimes, Melinda, people can experience purpose anxiety, right? And have lots of reasons, one day I'll get to my purpose or, and the book is really designed to help people step by step, really not only discover what's important to them, but to discover what are those aspects or parts of themselves that maybe they haven't had the opportunity to express in a way that would make all the difference in the context of who they are and what it is that they're here to do in the world. And so that's what the book is all about.
And it sounds like information is kind of taking that and moving it into an app and platform. So Deepa, do you want to talk a little bit about information, and also, how your own story would be great too?
Sure. Thank you again. Yes, as Ross said, we met, it was instantaneous. We knew we had to work together, and her book is actually a lot of what we spent 5 years working on. So I think I was a senior executive. I was the first partner of Indian descent to make that level. And so I was asking questions about purpose. I was asking questions about what my leadership looked like. I was looking around and had an amazing career. At that point, I'd been at the firm for 16 years. Was a senior leader, was really loving what I did, but just asking questions about what else. And my path had been different because I was the first Indian female partner, and I looked around and didn't see a lot of women of color executives in general in industry. And so I was asking different questions. And so I tapped her on the shoulder after the meeting and said, would you consider coaching me? And we began a 5-year coaching career program discussion. And here we are 5 years later. And I think through those discussions and through my own work, as Ross said, I was not only a partner in the firm with responsibilities with clients, but I also had a large inclusion role. I was responsible for a women's initiative for a 100,000 person organization. So asking really big questions about what else does this mean? And in those discussions and in my own sort of analysis, I started to ask bigger questions about women of color, which leads us to nFORMATION. And my 5-year, soul searching with Ra really led me to looking at what does leadership look like? And is it different for different groups, especially for women of color? And so nFORMATION was born out of a lot of those discussions, was born out of discussions we've both had with female leaders, women of color leaders, who I think are just questioning the things they've had to compromise on, the things they've had to conform around, how they show up in the workplace, and if it's different. And I would honestly say, Melinda, it's interesting. I think prior to June, the discussions around that were very different than we can have now. We can have very different discussions about the workplace. That wasn't even a term we could use before, without a lot of explanation. And so nFORMATION, even though, some of the ideas came prior to the summer, is really this safe space. It's an app for senior women of color to come together and find community, to find safe space, brave space, and new space, we say. Safe space in finding one another. I think a lot of us find ourselves isolated. We use the term the first, the fews, and the onlys. We're one of the first in our organizations or our families to work outside the home. We're one of the only people in our departments, in our groups, at the C-suite level, and one of the fews in our departments. And so that idea of safe space for that community to come together and talk is where we started. New space, because right now it feels like there's new conversations happening and that need to happen for women of color. And brave space, because I think a lot of what's being put on women of color, especially in the workplace, is what needs to evolve. How does inclusion change? Help educate not only the organization, but allies. And so we wanted to create a space where we could lean on each other and really have different discussions about what does that look like for us? And is our leadership different? And is now the time to really push for structural change? And what could that even look like? And so we've developed this app in this community, and we are fully launching at the end of January. We're in waitlist format right now, and we've had hundreds of women sign up, and there seems to be excitement and craving for this. And so it's an exciting time to be launching something like this.
Awesome. Yeah, and then, it's fascinating how things have changed since June. And I just turned in my manuscript for my first book on allyship and how to be an ally. And yay, I know, literally last night at midnight. Yeah. So Saskia, you said, I love your new homing background in the chat, and that this is not my home. This is, I went away and just kind of gave myself a little writer's retreat. So, and I will say that when I was I had to rewrite a lot of chapters. Because I could go deeper than I could have before to really go to some systemic inequities and systemic issues, and say words in the book that I wouldn't have said, or at least wouldn't have said so deeply. So it is a new opportunity. It's not the way anybody would have wanted it to happen, and it's good that there is this new awakening. So can we talk a little bit, just talk a little bit about terminology? What do you mean when you say women of color, and why did you choose women of color? I mean, there are a lot of terms, and there's a lot of kind of discussion around that terminology.
Yeah, maybe I'll start, Deepa, and you can dive in if you want. Yeah, I mean, I think, we believe and really put forth that this is a self-identifying opportunity. And I think that that's really important, Melinda, because the conversation of identity, as you know, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, is so complex, especially in this country, because we live in a country that historically has allocated, rank and file, dare I say, to certain types of identities. And there are lots of ways in which we can find ourselves on either the plus or the minus side of that. And so the first thing I would say is that we really hold open the space for women who are self-identifying as women of color. We see it as diasporic. And I raise it because I know that some of what you're alluding to is there has been quite a bit of discourse about Black women and the terminology of women of color being associated to Black women, and a real desire for Black women to be articulated and seen and represented as Black women, right? And I think that that's incredibly important. And I will say that we, in all of the conversations that we've been having and the discussions and some of the ways that we've been gathering women individually and collectively over the years, that there's also something very powerful when women identified as, who are self-identifying as women of color, come together and have larger conversations about the range and the depth and the breadth of their experiences. Also, we recognized, and Deepa and I have really been very intentional about this, is that women of color across culture often don't have a lot of space. Even if they work side by side in corporations, there are not necessarily a lot of places where they can have the deeper conversations about their own cultural experiences and what they carry into corporations and what they've had to let go of or shed in order to be able to show up in ways that feel in alignment with the culture, for better or for worse. And so, we feel that it is incredibly important to create this space, not only because of the shared experiences that women of color are having in corporations, but also because of the different experiences that women of color are having in corporations, and the ways in which we can learn from one another's as we go deeper around one another's experiences.
Awesome.
I would just add there, Melinda, it's something we've talked about quite a bit, especially in the last month or two. Post-election, there's been a lot of discussion about women of color, BIPOC, what are the right words to use, Black women, as Rob mentioned. And I think, I think we are really clear that people's experiences are different, and it is different to walk around. I talk about this all the time. I say it is different to walk as a Black woman in the United States, and we talk about that quite a bit. We recognize that. But I also think, from having spent 22 years in a corporate setting, that some of the experiences we face as women of color are shared, at least in the workplace. There are varying degrees to how that shows up, but this idea that there is a majority culture, or that there is something that leadership looks like, and the rest of us don't look like that, or don't feel that we're part of that group, or that we belong, and that we have to cater ourselves or conform in certain ways, is a real discussion. And so we've really focused on that. So I also think it's important to point out we're very much talking about corporate spaces, and so that is why we have really embraced that term, women of color. And we also went back to where it came from. So it came from the 70s. It came from Black women who were part of the feminist movement, looked around and said, our experience is really different. And as they gathered, they brought in other women of color and said, well, it seems like your experience is different as well. So for us, it is it's an embracing, it's a term of power. It's a way to say the group is really large. I'm writing a book on women of color right now, and as I look at the data suggests by 2050 we will be the majority of employees or workers in the workplace.
Yes.
And so there is such a power in the number, and so that's why we've really kind of leaned to it. It's not to negate anyone's experience or to peanut butter the experience, because we appreciate it's not the same, but it is to say that there is power in numbers, and what could we really do as a group if we band together and push on that a little bit.
The other thing that I would add is that we, and again, we know this, is that we are in a society, thank God, where we are embodying multiple cultures in one body, and I think there's also something about acknowledging the fact that many of us are multicultural in how we identify, and often struggle because we feel like we have to leave some aspect of our identity at the door in order to be able to be embraced and in order to be able to belong. And I think if we're really talking about innovation, and we're really talking about workplace in the future, and we're really talking about the future of leadership, then we also have to acknowledge and recognize that identity is evolving. We must honor history. This is very, very true. And at the same time, we also have to embrace where we're headed.
Yeah, absolutely. So Deepa, you kind of touched on this earlier, and maybe we could go a little bit deeper into women of color, particularly we're talking about leadership, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities, both, I think, for women of color leadership, maybe coming from your experience, what are some of those detailed pieces that women of color experience in the workplace that can be barriers, and how do we look at that differently?
Yeah, there's obviously so many, but I'll just pick on one or two. Sure. I think a lot of it is we don't see ourselves, as leaders. And as I'm interviewing women, I'm over 400 women interviewed as I do this book. So this is quite a large group. They're not seeing themselves, right? So there is a real question of, do I belong? Does my leadership look like the leadership ahead of me and before me? Or I maybe have certain feelings that are different. So I'll give you one example. I was speaking with a C-suite leader who has since retired and is now looking at what comes next for her boards and other things. And she said, as a woman of color, in particular a Black woman, she felt a real responsibility to bring issues in her community to the workplace. And that's not necessarily something that everyone at work did, but she felt a really great responsibility. She was at a pharmaceutical company to raise issues of access, right, to medicine and access to hospitals and medical care. As a woman of color, as a Black woman, that was very different for her. So I think that this, again, many issues we can touch on, but I think 2 or 3 that are really important are not seeing yourself in leadership. So questioning if you belong there, and that weighs on you and is a real constant discussion and dialogue. It creates imposter syndrome. It creates confidence issues. I think secondly, this sense of responsibility, like I'm taking I've been given this opportunity. I'm at the table. How do I show up for everyone who's not here? And I think although that is a wonderful opportunity, there is a lot of burden and weight that women carry as a result of that, of having to speak. One of the women said, right, if you remember, I speak for my whole race. I mean,
Yes.
I'm not just speaking as Deepa, I'm speaking for all Indian women, or Ra speaking for all Black women. That is a huge weight. And then I think thirdly, there is just a question of, are some of the things that are intrinsic to who I am and how I show up. You know, I think there's a lot of dialogue for Black women around hairstyle and presentation and clothes. I think for Indian women, there's a lot of discussion, for example, around expectations at home, and how do I bring, you know, the challenges of that duality of what's expected of for me at home to the workplace, and confidence and assertiveness, which are not necessarily always prized in some Asian communities, or in you know, at home, it's a little bit more deference and respect. So there's just differences. And how do you navigate that and talk about that when there's one ideal and one way to kind of succeed, and one idea of what success looks like? And so those are just 3 examples, but it is a really complex thing to navigate. And I think the biggest issue I would share is that we don't talk about those things until very recently, again, that June pivotal point, right, where discussions of race could finally happen in the workplace. I think there wasn't an open dialogue, but some of these challenges and some of these discussions were happening for women of color. So as they hit certain obstacles, or as they started to question themselves and maybe even opt out of coming out of the workplace because maybe they felt like, I don't have the confidence, or I'm not a sort of like, I don't have that voice, they couldn't go anywhere to have those discussions. So again, I think that is why finding Ra for me was so special, but also why we really created nFORMATION, is to realize that some of these things that you may think are Deepa or Ra, or, you know, are just about you, are really not about you. They are much more systemic or much more cultural. And you can work on them once you know they're not really about you, right? Once the shame is gone. So
the thing that I would add to that is also that as a woman of color, often when you enter the workplace, you're automatically working on culture, whether you have the title or not. And I think there are 2 sort of factors that feed into it. One is you do become a place where people come to get educated, right? And that whether there's permission or not, right? We just need to own that, right? That there is that sort of pressure. I also will say that there is a deep concern with how things happen. You know, traditionally, if we sort of think about power and the way that it operates in an organizational context, it's all about the results, right? It's all about the what. And we find that as we're talking with women of color and as they're sharing about their work experiences, there is a real reflection and a real deep concern and desire to also look at the how and the who, so that as we're looking at achievement, there's another aspect of what we value in the mix, right, as we define culture. So it's not just that we're results producing culture at any cost, but that actually we're able to work in ways that feel more honoring, that genuinely feel more inclusive, that genuinely feel more uplifting. And I think to some degree, many women of color don't feel that they can necessarily bring that natural and organic sense of concern into the culture in a way that is valued. They play the roles, but they don't necessarily, when it sits down, when it comes to evaluation time, or when it comes compensation time, or when it comes, like, those are not necessarily the things that are on the list of criteria of what is evaluated when one considers one's leadership and the success of one's role and contribution. But those things are played all the time, and they absolutely contribute to the bottom line. And so there's this explicit, implicit, right, conversation that also goes on for many women of color who are operating inside of these these corporate contexts about what the role really is.
Yeah.
And so I think there's an opportunity, for us as well to become more forthright about what those expectations are, and where we're saying yes and where we're saying no, and where that yes and that no is being heard or not heard, quite frankly.
And I think it's what that role really is and what that role really can be too, right?
Yes.
And we need to make space for different types of leadership. I mean, I will say, even as a white woman, as an executive a few years ago, I hit a wall where I was in a culture where that culture saw leadership in one particular way. It was older white men over 50, and a specific way that they led that was very different from the way I lead, and that was a huge issue for me, for them, for the culture. And then you add on top of that race and ethnicity, and you have a very different, even more of a kind of abrasive experience, I think, a lot. And so one of the ways I think that we can address that, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about how we address this in our workplaces, is by making space for new types of leadership, for new ways of people stepping in and stepping up and stepping forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We call it room and space, and we've written about it a little bit. And one of the things we're asking companies and allies to do is to not just invite women of color to the table. So we're starting to see in the last few months more women of color taking seats at the table, which is wonderful, and we want to encourage that. So we don't want to stop that. We need more. But once they get to the seat, do they have the room to actually use their full voice? Do they have the room to actually show up, to your point, in their full leadership, which, Ron, I believe is different as women of color, right? Is different for you as a white woman. It is different. And so how are companies and how are allies actually not only encouraging women to show up and take the seat, but actually to show up fully with their voice? And are they allowing for those discussions and that dissent? Are they asking, we want to hear more about how your perspective is different? One of the things we didn't touch on is microaggressions. I'm floored as I talk to all these women about the extent to which microaggressions happen, and the fact that a lot of corporate cultures, will dismiss them, like that doesn't happen often, right? Or just only happen once or twice, or just over there. And I think they're much more prevalent. And it's, to your point, why a lot of women of color, I think, don't show up with their full voice. So that idea of room and space, and actually addressing more systemically some of the true challenges of difference and different leadership, is really important if we're going to change culture and really allow full innovation. Ra often talks about this. I think part of what we're asking for with inclusion and with more diverse voices at the table is really allowing for real innovation to happen. I mean, what's happening now is we're stunting a lot of leadership, we're stunting a lot of voices. And so how do you create a space for everyone, not just for women of color, but for everyone, even white men, right? Yeah. A lot of them are stunted in how they can, express their full opinions on things in corporate culture. How do we create room and space for everyone to kind of really voice, what is true for them and true for their experience? I think that's really what's underneath a lot of what we're talking about.
And I think there's the opportunity to really consider that all of us can be better, like that all of us can benefit from different styles and different embodiments of leadership and different definitions of leadership and evolved value systems, right, within cultures that actually we all could get to thrive. And I think the thing that we're touching here and leaning against is that it is no longer acceptable for such a small percentage of leadership to be thriving and everybody else suffering. And that's whether you're looking at the state of our world or whether you're looking at the state of our organizations. And I think that, what excites me, I mean, there's so many things that excite me about, about this partnership with Deepa. But one of the things that really, really excites me is that if we did have that space to think about innovation, to think about some of the larger systemic challenges that we're dealing with in the context of our organizations and our societies, what would happen if just more people had the opportunity and the space to offer, their perspective, we've got to believe that we would get better. And so I think our work, because I know you, Melinda, you're about to go to take us here. I mean, I think our work is, one, creating a space where all of us can actually feel safe enough to have the more difficult conversations and the more challenging conversations about what is genuinely working or not working for all of us, you know, to really sort of pull back the facade and really start to, from a very honest place, about what's working and not working, and about what the possibility or the opportunity could be if we were able to allow more hands and hearts in the mix.
Yeah, so I was going there with like, okay, so what are the solutions? How do we, in our workplaces, how do we really create these spaces, and what else? What are the other things that that people can really do within their workplaces to better support women of color to grow as leaders and to be leaders even as they are? Maybe Deepa, if you have thoughts there.
I'll give you two different examples, because I think there's so many different things we can do here, and we need to look at different parts of, you know, what's happening in corporations or in corporate America. And I think one is making sure we're asking, right? I think it's been fascinating to watch since this summer, which companies are truly listening and which companies think they're listening, right? And are holding soundings, but not maybe really listening. And I think what we're really asking for now is a different kind of listening. So it's listening to all levels of the organization. It's not just listening to the senior level and saying, we don't see it here, so it doesn't exist. It's really finding ways to create space for different kinds of discussions to happen and voices to be heard. And that is not the normal, we'll just, you know, open a conference room or get on a Zoom call and ask the question and everyone will speak up. If you don't have a history of that, that's not going to be the norm. And so really, you know, trying different things, bringing in outside facilitators, asking really different questions, doing anonymous sounding. So there's a lot of things that companies can do there, or we can talk about that more. I think the second thing is looking at processes. We don't sometimes talk about that. So let's just take a simple one, complaint processes. In a lot of cases, complaint processes actually double victimize women of color or anyone who is complaining, right? So an incident happens, a micro or what I call a macroaggression. The woman, you know, voices maybe to her manager, eventually maybe files a complaint. Those processes actually turn very quickly and become about protecting the company, right? Just because that's how they're set up, their legal processes, they're not actually set up for the employee experience. And so I'm seeing a couple of cases, not many, but I'm starting to see a few cases where companies or new companies are emerging, women of color companies, which makes me really excited, but women lawyers who are now standing up companies to really do investigations in a very different way. And they're asking, there's one, Kia, Triangle Investigations in New York, and she actually wants to see if a company has 3 examples or 3 cases that have come up within, let's give it a time frame, the last 6 months or a year, that actually you hire an independent investigator to come in and look at all the data, not just the incidents, but actually the data and larger issues, see what other macro trends are going on, because maybe there's something else happening in regards to hiring and firing and promotions and pay. And so those are just 2 examples where I think we have to create space and ask different discussions and really be willing to hear the feedback, not just ask the question, which is what unfortunately some companies are doing. And then secondly, really look at the processes that support the employee experience and allow for the dissent and the infractions to really bubble up. And what do you do about it? They're going to happen. I don't think any company can expect to be perfect right now, right? And I don't think you want to be perfect right now. You actually want to uncover what's happening so you can change it. And we need to get to that space where it's not drama for uncovering, but it's actually, let's rally around how we can make this actually better for people.
Yeah, I think this practice of courageous facing and honest, deep looking across the board feels important and necessary. And I think that's whether you're looking at personal leadership styles and ways of operating and the sort of subcultures and dynamics that occur in organizations, or whether you're looking at the systemic policies and procedures. I mean, to Deepa's point, even the other side of that is, how is the person who raised the complaint treated? You know, so it isn't just necessarily that there's a corporate culture of protection, but there's also now this person is incredibly afraid They're afraid for their own job. They're afraid for their own sort of emotional safety in the space. And to what degree are there any efforts made to acknowledge the importance of, because I say this because, we get the double talk a lot, right? Like, oh, if there's ever a problem, please come to me, and literally, I think it takes everything in our power to go, yeah, right. Because we don't believe it. Right? Because we have XXX examples of where people have raised their voices and what happens? Well, they're not here anymore. And I think that threat is real. And I think that we've got to be willing to acknowledge how we've operated historically when people have spoken up in the face of people being urged to speak up. Right?
Yeah.
I'll just give one other example because I think it's imperative here. A certain corporation chose to have a sounding with the larger community in the face of doing cuts. So how much am I really going to say in a sounding?
Right. Is that really a safe space right there? Right.
I know. Right. I might be 2 words away from a pig slip, especially in a pandemic. So, I mean, so we have to really kind of, I think the practice of truth telling is maybe simplistic as it sounds on the surface. It's going to require deep, deep, deep looking and various forms of new ways of being and behaving to really get us there.
Yeah, yeah. So you touched on the fact that it's kind of, we have to look at 2 different things here. One is the kind of systemic processes, the systems, the processes, the inequities, the racism, sexism, ableism in our workplaces, in the core structure of our workplaces, that structural stuff, which I think is sorely missing and starting to be addressed now in many different companies for the first time, or in lots of different companies at a deeper level than it has been before. And also we have treating the impact of years and years and years and years of systemic inequity, of discrimination, of harassment, of bullying, and when we talk about microaggressions, I think it's important, and even in microaggressions, that you're not just that it's intervening, making it stop, working to create processes so that it doesn't happen in the future, and also looking at what the impact was and really addressing that as well, because the reality is that people show up differently, and I think that is some of what you were getting to, and also I think some of your other work, Ra, is in your coaching, and is how do you get to the heart of who somebody really is so that they can really show up as that person, as their full self.
1000%.
Yeah.
And I think that's the bigger, I just thank you for sort of naming this, because I think that is the bigger work that needs to happen. I feel like structurally, procedurally, people go, get it. Okay, I can understand it. But when you start to talk about what are the attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions that each of us carry, and how does that guide the way that we show up in our work context? And, not only what happens interpersonally, but what have we internalized that has caused us to show up in particular ways, right? And I think all of us have this work to do, in terms of how we recognize and understand all of the ways in which we've been conditioned and indoctrinated to show up in certain environments. Sometimes even the environment may not have that going on culturally, but we've come from other environments and we've imported our trauma right into new work environments. And we're operating, from old organizational trauma, and the current environment may not even have that in it. But where do we look? Where are those spaces? And how do we begin to create places where people can start to do that deeper internal work and recognize that the deeper internal work is also necessary, that this isn't just about moving pieces around the chessboard. This isn't just policy change. This isn't just sort of tick sheets and tip sheets and protocols. This is about people doing that deep internal looking and that personal growth work that should be an imperative for leadership.
Yeah. another thing we kind of touched on, but it didn't go deeper into it. I know, Deepa, you have some passionate thoughts about this, about power and the role that power plays in the workplace, and how that affects how women of color show up in leadership. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of the things that's coming out as I meet with all these women and I do writing for my own book is this idea of power. I think it's a complex idea, right? What we think of as power. And I would just ask your listeners and viewers to kind of just ask themselves this, right? Like, what does power mean to you? And where did that definition come from? How does it show up in your body? Someone asked me this week. It was a really fascinating discussion. Does it make you cower? Does it make you feel, stand back with your shoulders back? To Ra's point, we come with baggage or preconceptions or, based on how we grew up, ideas about that. And for me, I think a lot of what I'm asking women of color to do is to really look at power. I think power for us has been external, like this idea that power is external and we're maybe craving it or looking for it, or success is very tied to, seats of power. And I think what I'm realizing is because so much of those seats of power and leadership, as you even called it out, Melinda, is those, the seats taken by older white men, they don't necessarily resonate with the rest of us. And so we're aspiring to something that is actually inauthentic to maybe even who we are and how we show up. So it's a very nuanced, but a very confusing sort of discussion that happens for a lot of us. And so what I'm really asking women to think about, and where I've come to in my own thoughts around this, is that power for me, and I think power for a lot of women of color, needs to be about inner strength. It needs to be looking at who you are and alignment for yourself first. Like I have this visual, like I think we put power outside, right? We literally, it's something that sits outside of us. And I want us to take that power and put it inside of us and really carry that and have that show up and have that dictate when we push back on macroaggressions or microaggressions, have that dictate when we take on discussions, as long as we feel safe. I mean, I think that's the other really important thing. I don't want to lose in this whole discussion. It is not on women of color or women or anyone who is, not in a seat of power to take on the system or to take on people. I think you should do that if you feel safe, but only when you feel safe, right? We can't ask everyone to take on that responsibility. But I think that's also a sense of power. I think a lot of us feel powerful when we're able to make change. And I think that's really what we're looking for right now. And for me, that's what I've come to understand power to be, at least for me. It may be different for both of you, and it'd be interesting to hear what power is for each of you. But for me, power is ability to change things, is to actually create change in systems or in people. And that's what I think my work is in the world and what I've come to. But I also think it's really important that as women of color, we ask ourselves, what is success? What is power? And really make sure they are things that we believe and that we come to feel for ourselves, not because we've been told to crave them or want them or need them, because that won't work for us. And I think that's the big shift that's happening.
I think this opportunity to self-define and self-actualize is, for me, what's at the heart of power, right? And, we talk about this in our work in the context of information, as well as in the context of white awakening, which we'll talk a little bit about, I'm sure, at some point. But power to, there's both new notions of power: power to, power for, power with, power of, power within, right? As a alternative to what we've mostly known, which has been power over, and the idea of dominance and control. And I think this question of safety is really important because, as I've talked to women, it is amazing to me, not only how many of them feel unsafe, but how many of them have an expectation that that the environment is unsafe. Like, in other words, we're comfortable with the fact that it's not safe. Like, we've learned to adapt to the fact that it's not safe. So, many of the women talked about how they armor up, whether it's that bulletproof suit that they wear, or that, Deepa and I talked about this a lot, that bright red lipstick, or, those, that sort of, necklace, that bar necklace, or, gold necklace, gold plated necklace, whatever it is. But this way in which you get ready for battle. And just imagine, what does that do to your body, your mind, and your spirit every day, where you feel like you have to armor up in order to go into your place of work, which is a place where you spend more time often than you spend anyplace else, right? Now, we have shifted that in the context of our new reality. And that has been a challenge, right? Because, I was talking with a mom the other day and she said, well, what am I going to say if I'm in the middle of a Zoom meeting and my 3-year-old's running around behind me with no pants on? It's my humanity. That I actually have an identity outside of work is like a revelation. And for a very, very long time, she said, I was feeling really embarrassed about that, and so just what does that mean that you as a mother feel embarrassed about your child because your child is looking for his pants? You know what I mean? In the middle of a Zoom call, he's doing what he's doing. You know what I mean? And you're doing what you're doing. And why, is that not okay? And just those little things, and I say little, but they're huge. Because if you think about how profound that is, it gives us a sense of how deep the indoctrination is, how much we've been conditioned to button up and armor up in order to survive in these environments.
Yeah, Deepa, you asked, so I also think one more thing to add in terms of power is I think of stepping into your power, and there's so many people stepping into their power, finding their power and stepping into their power for the first time, trying it, seeing what it's like, stepping in, stepping out, stepping back, stepping forward. And the thing that needs to happen with people who are in power is allies, is to step back and allow other people to step into their power, or sometimes to lend your power when it can really help support somebody and help them grow into power. That would be the one thing, those two things I would add to that. We're already getting close to time, so I want to dive in a little bit into, Ross, some White Awakening and what you're working on there. You and I are both in interracial marriages, which is a fascinating kind of journey for me anyway, in terms of allyship and understanding and kind of deepening my knowledge. I suspect it is for you, and I've talked about it, so I know it is for you too. And you and Corey have been working together to really kind of build and grow allies. Can you talk a little bit about that work and what you're working on?
So for the last 20 years, Corey, my husband, and I have been doing race relations work. And we actually, interestingly enough, met through one of his race relations projects. And he often jokes about the fact that he cannot promise that result for everybody.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
However, it was how we came to actually meet one another. And it was actually through that work that we really discovered that there was more there for us than just our passion for a better world. But this new body of work really came because as the events of the summer began to unfold, both of our phones were just ringing off the hook with white leaders in various industries and various capacities who were trying to figure out what to do, right? And in some cases, people who had never been open to this conversation. I mean, this is one of the things that we're underscoring, and that we're in a new moment, and that there's an opening that just didn't even exist 8 months ago, to really want to have these conversations and begin to interrogate the realities of people who maybe just were never even aware of the fact that other kinds of realities existed. And so the work of White Awakening is really to help even recontextualize the way that we think about this work. So, we have tremendous respect for the scholarship that exists, and there is incredible scholarship that exists in terms of helping us understand historically how we got here. And what we've recognized is, though, we need to really populate the field and build the field with more opportunities for helping us figure out how we get out. Right. And part of the reason why, and it's important to own this, is that it has taken so much to even get us to look, that we haven't even had the ability to start to figure out, okay, what happens once people are looking? And so on some level, you and I both know this, Melinda, like there's a lot of kind of a little bit of the scramble on the part of the field, because now people are willing to look. It's like, wait a minute. Okay, now that you're willing to look, how do I meet you? So all of that to say that the context of our work is rehumanization, because we fundamentally believe that all of us have been dehumanized by this. no matter where you are standing in this equation, that this is the conversation of dehumanization. And so it's important for us to understand how we got here. And it's also incredibly important for us to understand how we make our way out. And so the work of White Awakening is the awareness piece. We begin with helping people understand how we got here, but then also helping people understand what is it really going to require in order for us to get out. And that is the work of rehumanization. And so there's an assessment, there's a webinar, and then there's a digital course that supports that work.
Awesome. So this kind of, we have a question from somebody who wanted to remain anonymous around allyship. And they say, I have a very hard time trying to provide advice to my female friends of color when they have issues in the workplace. I'm in my 50s, so I understand part of what they may be experiencing, but I really don't feel I have the tools to help them. This person says. So any thoughts, advice for this person?
I can go raw. I think, I would want to know what it is they're trying to help solve for, because I think the specificity of what the challenge is really important. I also think, I got to a point in my career where I was looking for other women of color, to be honest with you. And I think as an ally, what you can do is listen, provide advice, give suggestions, really validate the feelings. Because I think so often what I'm hearing women of color hear is, oh, that's not that bad. Or I had something similar, even though, I'm a white woman, I don't really understand how that happens for you, And so really making sure, one, that you hear and validate, I think, but secondly, I think it's encouraging women of color to find other women of color. I really do think, I know that ties to nFORMATION, but I'm not meaning it to be. I genuinely think there's something happening right now where women of color are having conversations they've never had before in some of these things, especially across groups of women of color. And there is power in that, and there is learning in that, and there's experience in that. And I think when issues come up, just to be able to call upon another woman of color makes a huge difference. There is data that suggests that when you hear something negative, you carry that for much longer than if you hear something positive, right? It's just a fact. That's a psychological fact. And so knowing that, we tend to carry these negative things or these issues or these tensions much more than we, a positive comment. So knowing that if you can find a group, even if it's a small group or just one or two people, to really share that with and to let go of it, when an incident comes up, I think that's really what I would encourage without knowing the context of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
I would also add listening goes a long way. I think sometimes we feel like we have to solve it, but the truth is that listening is what builds that trust, is what builds that capacity to really be able to understand and empathize and really take in what's happening and what's occurring. And so I would certainly say to that woman to listen and to just say, I'm here, and I may not know exactly what you need, but if there is something that I can do, please don't be afraid to ask me. And with you. And I know that this is important, and I know that this has been hurtful, or I want to see you succeed. And I would like you to know that I'm a resource for you. So if there are ways that I can be supportive, because sometimes I think we want to suggest without permission. And sometimes I think there's something different that happens when you lead with listening and you lead with the offer of support and allow that woman or those women to guide and lead those conversations and what that support could look like.
Awesome. And this person just chimed back in and said that the person she's thinking about is experiencing possible discrimination in the workplace, and it's race related. So this helped. Yeah. And Stephanie in the chat says amen on the listening. Ra, maybe you could, based on your work, you could just answer this question. Kind of, Jamal asks where microaggressions and macroaggressions are coming from? Are they coming out of a lashing out or of embarrassment, or what is that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think often the microaggressions come out of an awkwardness and sometimes even a genuine curiosity, a curiosity with not a lot of skill or capacity for how to explore that curiosity with another person in a way that feels honoring and safe, is one of the things I will say in terms of what shows up in the context of microaggressions. In the context of macroaggressions, we have real work to do. And I think sometimes we assume that, oh, there's probably far more microaggressions than there are macroaggressions. I have to say to you, in my listening, I have seen a tremendous particular resurgence in the last couple of years of macroaggressions. And in those particular cases, there is a threat, a fear, or threat to someone's quality of life, a threat to someone's status, a threat to someone's power or influence. And this is a place where we need to have bigger conversations about even how we understand power. We right now interact with power as if it is this finite pie, and there's certainly only so many slices. And if you get more, I automatically get less. And anything that represents itself or feels like a loss of power is threatening. And there is the instinct to want to survive. And anytime anyone is in a place of survival, whether they are consciously aware of it or not, they will lash out. They will get aggressive. They will do things that may even be way outside of their normal character because they are in a place of survival, whether they are conscious of that or not. And so part of what our opportunity is going to be to really talk a little bit about, and again, creating safe spaces where the anger and the fear can be unearthed and can be dealt with in a way, I'm going to say this because this is bold, I get it, loving and compassionate. And I say this because oftentimes we villainize white men, or we villainize sometimes even white women in seats of power, and we forget their humanity. And that is just as problematic as not recognizing or honoring the humanity of women of color. We are all human beings in this. And unfortunately, so much of the way that we've been indoctrinated in organizational culture has taught us to leave our humanity at the door. And we can no longer do that and expect to be healthy. No organizational culture can expect to be healthy if you are suppressing the humanity, your own humanity or the humanity of others. And so we have to work through that. And we have to create spaces where other people who are feeling the temptation to lash out or who may be lashing out, we have to create spaces where they can understand what's going on with themselves so that they can then examine how they want to show up in the context of their own life and their own leadership. Yeah.
Powerful words, Ra, and really important. I want to, we have just a 1 more minute left, but I want, you both are very powerful women that have really stepped into power and into leadership roles. Could each of you just say in a few words how you would have wanted allies to step up for you as you kind of navigated your own leadership and your own power? Deepa, do you have that?
Yeah, I will share that. It's funny, I was thinking about this earlier this week. I had a lot of white male leaders step up for me. And as I talk with women of color, that's actually pretty common. I think it's, who sits in the seats of power, but there is also, just to say it, and we don't have time to unpack it, a lot of tension between women, and women aren't always supportive of other women. And I'm hearing that quite a bit as I talk with women. right now, which is disappointing, and I want to change that, but that's a different show. I think just listening, like Ross said, I think asking more questions. I think you mentioned, Melinda, kind of, I call it sharing your shine. So if you are sitting in a seat of power, taking a woman of color with you, asking what else you can do, inviting them to a meeting, intervening on their behalf. I think those are all really important things. And I would just share something for, I'm talking to a lot of high potential women of color in particular. I think they feel that pressure. I think they feel a lens of success on them. I think that for them, when something goes wrong, they are looking for people to really intervene and step in and help them. And I think that doesn't always happen. So you can't, on one hand, be a company that's saying you want to advance hypo women of color, and then when something happens that seems a little bit off, not really help them. And so that's what I'd really ask for. What I would say is really different in what we need right now. We need companies to do what they're saying they want to do, but really show up in a totally different way.
I think this is so good, Deepa. I think the other thing that I would say is being willing to be vulnerable and uncomfortable, and bearing witness to my experience has gone a long way. And I think sometimes when we feel indicted in what someone's saying, we want to either shrink back, or we want to change the subject, or we want to Deepa's point, minimize it. But growing our capacity to be vulnerable and uncomfortable in situations where maybe usually we're the one with the answer, or we're the one leading the charge, being willing to kind of put that down for a little bit and just be human to human, person to person, and really bear witness, which means really not only hear what I'm saying, but feel what I'm saying, emotionally take it in, be willing to see the impact that it's had on me. And then I think, when we're ready, go to strategy, when we're ready, but not sort of jump to strategy immediately, because I think often the experience can be stepped over, which does not deepen and strengthen our capacity to see it when it happens, and to know and actually understand a little of what it feels like.
Yeah. Well, we're a couple of minutes over, and thank you all for sticking with us, and for your great questions and your chats too. Deepa, where can people learn more about information?
Deepa? Yeah, they go to nFORMATION.com. They can find more information about nFORMATION.
Okay, awesome. Thank you both. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being you. Ra, as always, a pleasure. And Deepa, I'm so glad that we had a chance to connect and talk together.
And thank you for your work and doing this. It's so important, especially right now. So thank you so much.
We appreciate you, Melinda.
Thank you.
Go celebrate.
Yes, go celebrate. I've turned in my manuscript. Exactly. Woo!
We cannot wait to read the book. Cannot wait.
Yeah, thank you. So everyone, I'll leave you all with this question. What action are you going to take? What action will you take to be an ally for women of color moving forward? Join us each week for Leading with Empathy and Allyship. Each Tuesday, you can RSVP for future sessions and sign up for our newsletter at changecatalyst.co/allyship series. We have one more episode in this series, and then we'll be starting up again in January. Please subscribe to the podcast and the YouTube channel, and give us a like, a thumbs up, a review, whatever platform you're on, and share it with colleagues, with friends that could use it. All right, thank you all. And I'm seeing thank yous in the Q&A and in the chats as well. Appreciate you all too. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.